every time we say goodbye, my dear. I don't know why it's so unclear. Your mouth says go away, but your body's telling me to stay.
Hello everybody, and welcome to There and Then. I'm your host, Tom Gutteridge. This is a podcast where we take a look at the works of one Canadian author, my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, and find out what inspires him, what inspired him to write, and how his works fit into the broader picture of CanLit as a whole. Now, this episode is a doozy. It's going to be about twice the length of all the others, because we're discussing three works that form what's called Grandpa's mythic tetralogy. They are Riel, Coppermine, and Tecumseh. Three books that were all published in the early 70s. In the early 70s. These are tough works by the standards of the ones we've looked at so far. Their subject matter is darker. They touch on parts of our history that can be a little distressing at times. But ultimately, they're really great works, and they represent an earlier time in Grandpa's writing that I've never really had access to because I wasn't alive when they were written. I've known Grandpa to be a writer of heartfelt and thoughtful works, but there is a darkness in some of these works that you just don't see in his more recent stuff, and it's been fascinating to explore that and to explore that with him and see how it makes him feel all these years later. Now, a few warnings up front. First would be, because I initially thought I would release these podcasts in chronological order, these are actually some of the first recordings Grandpa and I made. We were still getting our sound design down at this point, and so there's a little bit more popping and hissing than I would like, and just generally things are not quite as level as I would hope. Hopefully you find it listenable and not too distracting. If you do find it distracting, all I can do is apologize. The other thing that it would be irresponsible for me not to mention is that all three of these works deal with indigenous peoples, and whenever you have two white guys discussing the history of indigenous peoples in Canada, you're in dicey terrain. I think we handle all the issues sensitively and know that there is absolutely no hate in either of our hearts. The one thing that can get a little tricky is we're trying to use appropriate nominators. So I try and say Aboriginal, Indigenous whenever possible. Grandpa's from an older time. He says Indian. If we have Indigenous listeners that are offended by this, I apologize. It really is not our intent to be hurtful. It just, I don't know. I don't even know if there's a justification for it other than this is just how it went. And I offer you my apologies up front if you are offended. I think we treat the issues with candor and sensitivity and know that we're supporters. Now, the first work we're going to be discussing, Grandpa and I, is one called Riel, which was first published in 1968. Its full title is Riel, A Poem for Voices, and it does take the form of almost a stage play. It's a great book, and it's one of the ones Grandpa's most proud of. I think of the three, it's the one he likes the best, so we'll start there. So, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Don.
I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
All right, hi everybody and welcome. I am here with my grandfather Don Gutteridge today, and we're going to be speaking about his book Riel, A Poem for Voices, originally published 1968, and the version I'm looking at was published in 1972. Hey Grandpa, how are you today?
I'm fine, thanks, Tom.
Great, well I'm very happy to be with you here again. I'm very excited to talk about this book. Now, Louis Riel is of course a figure in Canadian history that has attracted substantial interest over the years. How did you get interested in writing about Riel?
I went to see a play called Riel by a man named Coulter that was produced here in London in the, probably 64 or 65.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very good play, but it just told the story straightforward. And I thought that there must be a better way to tell the story that would grab Canadians rather than just a linear narrative, which is what the play was about.
Mm-hmm.
And but I didn't do anything about it until I picked up a book by Kinsey Howard called Strange Empire,
Right.
The Story of Louis Riel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a somewhat romanticized version, which appealed to my imagination.
Right.
Certainly my poetic my poetic imagination.
Yep.
And I thought, there's the outlines of what I'd like to do.
Right.
How the form came to mind, I don't know. I had been writing longer 300 or 400 line poems
Mm-hmm.
that were straight narratives.
Right.
But I thought, I'll try a new format this time.
Mm-hmm.
I was very attracted to radio plays. And I
Right.
thought, what I'd like to do is to write it so it could be performed on the radio. And it would be the story of Riel told through various voices that had to do with his life.
Okay, so it's interesting. So basically what Grandpa's referring to is the poem for voices of the title actually is reflected in the content where rather than just being a series of straight-ahead poems, it's performed from the points of view of the various actors within it. Do you think that's an accurate way to describe it, Grandpa?
Yes, it would be. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So prior to Riel, you had a few long-form historical poems.
Yes, I did.
And we were just trying to hash through it. One of them was, I believe, about Champlain.
Right.
One about Jean de Brébeuf.
Yeah.
And then we're as yet unclear about what that
Unclear.
third one was.
And I can't find the original copy.
Right. When were you writing those?
In the early 60s, probably 63, 64.
Okay. And were you writing just what I would, I guess, in quotations, regular poetry at this point too?
Actually, no. I was starting to write novels at the same time.
Right.
And no, those there were a few lyric poems,
Mm-hmm.
but some of which appear in A Village Within. Some of those early poems appeared in that collection.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was doing the short lyric as well, but I didn't get into it fully until the late 60s after Riel.
Okay. Because these sort of the three books we are going to talk about in this grouping are Riel, A Poem for Voices, Coppermine, A Quest for North, and Tecumseh, also known as, is it Tecumseh Dreams and Visions?
Right.
Okay, yeah, we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. And all of what I come to understand is your poetry that is more lyric and continues to today came after this.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything specific that got you wanting to write about these historical topics? We talked about a little about this before, but was there one impetus, or was it just an accumulation?
No, I minored in history in university, so I've
Okay.
always been interested in history.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, my very first poem in grade 7
Yeah.
was a story of Wolfe and Montcalm. And
Okay.
it was done in ballad form,
Really?
four line stanzas in grade 9. That was my first poem,
Yeah.
but I didn't come back to that format until a little later.
Right. It's very interesting. And so the idea of doing this poem for voices, was that, I guess what I'm trying to say is, was that your intent from the get-go, or did that happen as you started writing?
That was my intent from the get-go. I had
Okay.
the title and the subtitle ahead of time, yeah.
It was sort of a fully formed idea that you had to just flesh out.
Yeah, that had to be fleshed out.
It's very different than the other two in the group. It's different, very different than Coppermine, very different from Tecumseh.
Yes.
It's very, there's a singleness of vision in this that I really enjoy. It's very engaging. Now, the one thing I think is one of the great strengths of the book, and I have my highly flagged personal copy here. I've flagged it with a purple flag whenever we're hearing about Riel from Riel's perspective. Mm-hmm. And the thing I think it captures really well is, he's sort of a controversial figure because people weren't convinced he was in his right mind.
That's right. He was.
He was very convinced he was in his right mind.
Yeah. He probably could have avoided hanging if he had admitted that he was psychologically impaired, but he refused to do that because he said, I want my name to go down in history with my people, and I don't want them to think of me as a madman.
Mm-hmm. And through the way the verse is constructed, throughout the earlier parts of the book, when it's a younger Riel, circa Red River Rebellion, into his period of exile, he's mostly lucid. He's thinking a lot about the cycles of the world out on the prairie, and it's quite concrete the way he's seeing things. Later on in the book, he goes to a much more fragmented narrative.
Yes.
And I don't know if that was intentional, but it certainly captures the tension in his mind.
That's what I was trying to do. There was the psychological pressure was building up, and he was beginning to fragment. In fact, the poem ends with a kind of double vision on two columns on the same page.
I believe I have that flagged in here too. This is where he's taking the stand in his own defense at his treason trial. I believe that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
And the one half of it is sort of a somewhat... Oh yeah, here we go. It's him addressing the court, and the one half of it is his sort of reasoned defense of himself, stating what you had just said. And the other half is more of the... what we saw at the beginning of the novel, which was him thinking about the land and his people. It's interesting. Now, in each of these books, and we'll talk about them in turn, there are certain sort of touchstones you go back to. And in this one, the idea of cycles is a huge thing. It comes back again and again and again to the cycle of the world, the cycle of development, and then Riel's own cycles between lucid and not so lucid.
And the buffalo hunt.
Yes. Well, that sort of brings me to one of the interesting things I want to talk about the early novel. Now, the character of Scott, and what is his first name? What is his full name? It's Thomas.
Thomas Scott.
Thomas Scott is an interesting character. Now, he was the fellow that during the Red River Rebellion, he was the one that was executed, correct?
Yes, right.
Right. He in this book he does not come off very favorably.
No. And he was not really a buffalo hunter. I just thought he would have been if he could have been, because he wasn't out there long enough to get into that. But he was known as a man who swore and cursed the Métis and in fact led an armed insurrection against them at one point.
Well, and that was where they were eventually imprisoned, and his execution followed that.
That's right. And that's controversial in the historical record, because the main reason that was given by Riel was his insubordination and the way he talked to him and to the Métis. And that was a cause célèbre in English Canada.
Yeah. It sounds like Riel had sort of pardoned at least one of his co-conspirators, had reluctantly pardoned another one, and then Scott was the one he decided to not bend.
Yeah. And
that was sort of what brought an end to the rebellion indirectly.
That's right. That brought the army out.
Now, one of the interesting parts of this book is the descriptions of the conditions that army was facing as they're traversing west to Manitoba.
Oh, yeah, I kind of forgot about that.
No, it's very interesting, because I had never really thought about the fact that once you get above the Great Lakes, there's not really a way to get overland.
No.
Other than this describing this expeditionary
it was really
force.
an amazing march.
Yeah. This is in an era of many of these marches. I always think about, what was it? Burgoyne's expedition in the Revolutionary War, where they, headed south from Buffalo or wherever it was through hundreds of miles of broken terrain. At least there they were in the woods. The idea of a whole British army traversing with canoes and portaging
portages, yeah, through the Lake of the Woods and that lake after lake after lake.
And there's the bit in this where they talk about being attacked by a swarm of mosquitoes, and they've made it, but I think the world is cold and naked. The word is cold and naked because they're just completely drained by the transit out there.
Yeah. Well, in 1775, an American army marched up through the southern Quebec woods to attack Quebec in 1775.
Yeah.
And that was another unbelievable forced march.
Mm-hmm. The hardships that they endure are pretty. For some reason, that was a passage that really really stuck with me, just because it was hard days. Even though we're when we talk about Coppermine, we're talking about almost at least 50 years earlier than this.
Mm-hmm.
But the hardship people are facing out in the West Country is still pretty similar.
Yeah.
Another thing that sort of ties the narrative together are these letters to the mail.
Oh yeah, Charles Mayer wrote. Yeah, and I found them in the archives, and I got on to Mayer, of course, because he was part of my original research. He wrote a long poem, and
right,
and on Tecumseh.
Yes.
Yeah, he wrote a long poem on Tecumseh, and that's how I came across him. And then I thought, when I read the historical record, he was mentioned, of course, as one of the Canadian Party.
Yes.
But I knew from my studies in university that Mayer was one of the early Canadian poets in our Canadian Lit course. And so all of that sort of came together, and I thought, here's an interesting character. And then I discovered that he had written all these letters to the Globe.
Yeah, and sort of alternately sort of describing conditions in the West, and then passing judgment on the Métis rather harshly in a lot of them.
And then you have squares and circles.
Mm-hmm.
The surveying party was the sort of inciting incident, because they were going to divide the countryside up into square miles.
Yes.
And the Métis always, as they did in Quebec, the farms drew back from the river in long, thin strips.
Yes. Well, what I think they called that the seigneurial system, right? So when you go flying over Quebec, you can still see it, all the skinny, long parcels of land heading out from the rivers. I'm trying to find this. Yeah, okay. There's a few of these letters from Mayer sort of, they're interspersed throughout the novel.
Well, and their purpose really is to show the value clash between the way the Métis looked at life and the way Canadians in the East looked at life. He was trying to sell the West as a place to be colonized, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the Métis live there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the Métis sometimes get a little bit of a short shrift in terms of coverage in Canadian history. I was describing that I had to. Yeah, Riel is well known, and
he's a father of Confederation.
Yeah. Well, and the thing I had forgotten about Riel was that he was actually a member of Parliament.
And he signed the book. But he was a wanted man at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, what happened was when the army arrived, he decided to take off, and then they put a price on his head.
Yeah, a significant one.
But then he ran in the riding of Provencher after Cartier died and won it.
Yeah.
And so they kicked him out of Parliament, and he came back and he won the seat the second time, and this time he sneaked in and signed the book.
Yeah, sneaked in, took the oath, and then snuck back away into hiding. And this leads a little bit to, we're sort of getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I don't think that's a problem. We have the book itself. Now, I'm looking right now at the Van Nostrand Reinhold 1972 collection. Like a lot of these books from this time, especially these the historical poems, they're out of print long now, but you can occasionally find copies of them. You will find copies of this Van Nostrand Reinhold edition of Riel. You might not find the earlier.
No, it would not have made Amazon.
Yeah. Now, the one thing I really like about this Van Nostrand Reinhold edition is the art. There's these really, I mean, they certainly have that that sort of early 70s appropriation art feel to them, where they're the portraits of Riel cobbled together from different photographs and stock images. They're very cool. Now, the formatting in this book is very striking. Did you have any part of this, or is this again more artistry on behalf of the part of the publisher?
Artistry on the part of the publisher. No, I was absolutely amazed. I love that little book. I love the feel of it and the look of it.
Now, the one thing I wanted to get into is this actually has been staged in a couple of different formats before, correct?
It was done by the CBC on the national radio. And in fact, I've just sent the old reel-to-reel tapes out to California to be put onto CD.
Oh, yeah?
And I'm hoping to have that within a week. And I'm going to make extra copies for you.
That's great to hear.
And I'm going to have, they also did Borderlands, the fourth of the epics.
Right.
That we're not dealing with directly.
Right. Well, we'll have to cut those up and see if we can.
And they had I had the cast written down, but I have lost it. But they had top CBC actors, radio actors, doing the voices.
And was it serialized? Was
No.
it just a one?
It was a 1 hour performance.
Wow. And so they would have done it in a somewhat pre-seed form, or did they do it in its entirety?
They did it in its entirety.
Wow.
Yeah, and
that's amazing.
And with the headlines were sort of shouted out by one of the characters, and they did a terrific job. I haven't listened to it for years, so I'm looking forward to the CD.
Yeah, that'll be great. I look forward to listening to that, and then we'll put together a bit of an addendum for this episode so that everyone else can hear it too, because I think it would be. Yeah. I mean, there is a certain appeal to the old CBC. They really did some wonderful things, and they still do. But I think CBC Radio has really done some.
This was a producer in Vancouver who kept looking for Canadian material, and so I don't know how he found out about Riel, but he did. And then after Riel, he said, "Have you got any more?" And I said, "Yeah, I've just written one called Borderlands that would do very well because it's two voices, John Jewett, the pioneer, and McQuina, the Indian figure."
Yes.
And the poems go back and forth throughout the book, and so it plays very well as a radio drama.
Yeah. Well, and I think this one it certainly would play on stage, absolutely. Both as sort of a collection of monologues and as an overall narrative. It's really
Well, I kind of hope that myself, because they Stratford staged Michael Ondaatje's Billy the Kid.
Yep.
And I was thinking at the time, God, if I wish I had I was so naive in those days.
Yeah.
I didn't see myself as a professional writer. I was a teacher and then a professor, and I wrote.
Yeah.
And I never got an agent until 2003.
I recall. I recall.
And an agent is the person who does these sorts of things for you, who'd have contacts in Stratford and say, would you at least look at this material and see whether it's able to be dramatized? But that never happened.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can look at it for the future. We wasn't there something with Riel? I think you described this to me once where
Rude. That would be my phone making a noise. We'll edit that out. Wasn't there a point in time where Riel was being considered for part of the curriculum in Manitoba?
Yes, I was informed by the publisher that they had got a request or a missive from Manitoba that they were considering it.
Yeah.
And what happened was one of the members of the selection committee didn't like the way I treated Thomas Scott because he was an Orangeman.
Oh.
And so they cashiered it, and I lost a few thousand sales. But it sold 5,000 copies. It's my bestseller poetry book because it was used in drama classes all across the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's this sort of leads into what I was wanting to talk to you about. Now, the amount of Riel scholarship these days is huge. I mean, Riel is, it says right in his Wikipedia, he's one of the most written about figures in Canadian history. Now, if we go back 40 years, was he still has he always, in your experience, been the type of figure we see him as today?
No, I don't think so. I think that his rehabilitation occurred in the late 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And as part of the general movement among Native peoples to have their voices heard.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there was a great deal of discussion in the early days of the appropriation of voices, and I went through that controversy and always felt that writers should be free to appropriate a voice, because if they make a mistake, the reader can make the decision. It's up to the reader to decide whether I have messed it up or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's open to interpretation. And I think people get...
But of course, my treatment was entirely sympathetic. And except for Thomas Scott. I tried and treat MacDonald fairly, his little section about his daughter who was handicapped, and the fact that he really didn't want to deal with this. I mean, his problem was it was too far away from Ottawa, and in some ways he didn't care what happened until, of course, they killed Scott.
Yeah, well,
and then there was an uproar in Ontario.
He talks about in the section featuring John A. It's talking about him having endured an interminable series of meetings.
Yeah.
with I guess, is it Riel's delegation that he sends back?
Yeah, that he sent back. Yeah.
To try and negotiate a future.
Basically to create Manitoba.
Yeah, an autonomous future for Manitoba, and he you get the impression that it's just not his. It's not what he wants to be dealing with, and there's a paper that Grandpa shared with me. It's really quite good. It's very dense. Was he a scholar out of UWO?
He had an MA, but he was also a theater critic. He wrote reviews of Stratford, and he was basically what I would call a literary man.
Yeah. Rather
than a scholar.
Yeah. Well, I'll edit his name in here because I don't remember it. But in this paper, he talks about where was I going with that?
Keith Garabian is the name.
Keith Garabian,
the scholar.
Yeah, and he sort of feels that oh man, I completely lost my train of thought on that one. We'll come back around to that one. So I think from what you've described, it sort of fits with my understanding of it, was that Riel may be venerated now, but he was a more controversial figure for a long time.
Oh, definitely. Certainly when I started, he was. And Kinsey Howard's book wasn't particularly well received.
Yeah.
Because it was an attempt to rehabilitate him by showing that he was a very serious, messianic character with a lot of appeal.
Well, and it's something that in the current discussion around Indigenous voices, I think and I do not profess to be an expert on this, lest the reader think I'm coming from a position of authority, the listener I am not coming from a position of authority on this. Don't send me any emails. Send me an email, but I'm not trying to be contentious when I say it seems like a lot of, and perhaps rightfully, the indigenous voices people want to speak to now are the ones that sort of represent the older ways, right? Riel, coming from that Métis background, it's interesting to see the sort of the images of sort of the traditional animism of the indigenous people melding with his clear Christian
definitely
devotion.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he was a good Catholic in many ways. Yeah.
Well, and he certainly had messianic tendencies.
But you could see the appeal for a writer to get a character with that kind of psychological conflicts going on.
Well, and if I can't put myself firsthand in the climate of the early 1970s, but at that point in time, this wouldn't have been I don't think it's that you were being controversial, but I think it would have been an interesting treatment of this character we wouldn't have seen much of at that point.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Do you feel like you received any backlash at the time?
No, I got 2 or 3 reviews, and there weren't many review journals in those days.
Yeah.
And but they were quite favorable, so
Good.
I was very pleased.
That's good.
But I got no other specific feedback. Poetry in general was more popular in the early 1970s.
Yes.
My early books with Oberon routinely sold 1,000 copies. Now they sell 120.
Yeah. And I think that's not just you. The poetry itself is just not as popular now as it was.
Yeah.
And when you went into, and we'll talk about this, but the period of your writing that follows this, there is some poetry there, but you are going more into the novel as a form.
My first novel was in 1973, Bus Ride.
Yep.
My second one was in 1980 or 1981, All in Good Time.
Right.
And then I spent probably 3 years working on Lily's Story in the mid-'80s.
Right.
And didn't really write a lot of poetry until the late 1980s.
And that's sort of when you became much more prolific, and I think you've...
And I continued to write both novels and poems. Yeah, I wrote the 2 little memoir novels, which we discussed in our first podcast.
Yes.
And then I got on to Mark Edwards' mysteries and wrote 12 of them as well.
And it's interesting. So we'll talk a little more about the connection to Tecumseh when we're talking about that book. Was there also a UWO production of Riel at one point?
Not of Riel, no, of Tecumseh.
Oh, okay. I was getting my wires crossed there.
Yeah.
That makes more sense. Okay. Well, that's and we'll talk about that in our upcoming episode. Now, basically, the one thing I was interested in is contrasting Riel to, in this group, the one that comes next is Coppermine.
Right.
Riel, Coppermine, and as you will hear, it is a dark tale, and it is very raw, and I think it's very fair in its treatment of the subject matter, but overall, I don't find Riel to be as foreboding of a story. No. It's a very fully fleshed out concept. It was clear you knew what you were going for with this one. I guess my question for you is, we've talked about this before, but you seem to have a real affinity for writing about the Indigenous history of Canada, and it usually tends to be in through the filter of their interactions with the early settlers and colonizers of this territory.
Exactly.
Riel is probably your, I guess, chronologically speaking, is your latest of these works, right? Because Tecumseh comes a little before.
Right.
And Coppermine even before that.
Right. And Borderlands probably around the same time. So
yep. Yeah. It's just sort of interesting to see how there are certain themes stay the same, but then the themes of modernity in this one are much more distinct.
And of course, you probably noticed I used long lines for the last time in my career.
This is what I was leading up to. The one that comes next, Coppermine, is the start of what I see for the remainder of your poetry is very short, spare lines.
Right.
Riel is page width lines a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Now, was there anything that consciously drove you that way, or was it just how your craft evolved?
No, the 3 previous narratives that I published in the early 60s were all written the same way, with the almost not really perfect iambic pentameter, but with that notion in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no way of knowing why I do these things, but
yes.
So Riel was a continuation of my early 60s work.
Yeah.
And when I got to Coppermine,
mm-hmm.
suddenly the sort of psychotic episodes that
mm-hmm.
permeate the book
mm-hmm.
required the shorter kinds of verse.
Yeah.
And in The Village Within, which was my first Point Edward poems, I'd say the lines were sort of medium length.
Mm-hmm.
And the lines were, unlike the ones I did later, which are 3-beat lines, the lines were what I call natural lines, or they would be a thought or a phrase.
Yeah.
And so they could be of a variety of lengths.
Mm-hmm.
But my publisher, Fred Cogswell at Fiddlehead Books, said Riel has some good poetry and some good rhetoric.
Yeah,
I thought that was a pretty good summary.
Yeah, I think it's I think it sums it up nicely. The as far as the pantheon of your work, I think it's one of the most atypical of your works of poetry.
Yes.
But I guess the question I ask you every time is, how does it feel to read it after all these years?
There are certain sections, like the buffalo hunt and the little poem about a Métis walking, which I often read aloud at readings in those days when I used to read excerpts from it. Those were really my favorite parts of it. But no, I thought I thought it read very well. I enjoyed reading it again, and just as I enjoyed writing it very much.
Yeah. Was this something that you would read from often?
No.
Yeah.
In fact, your suggestion that we go back and look at the epics, as I call them, I had to go back after many, many years and have a look at them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the same way with my lyric poetry. I don't sit down and reread my own books because I'm still writing. Probably if I quit writing, when I write myself out, just to amuse myself, I'll go back and have a look at earlier works.
And so this is, it's somewhat of an aside, but I am interested. So I know you still write poetry because I'm the recipient of a lot of it. Are you working on any novels currently?
I haven't written a line of fiction since 2007.
Okay.
And I've even had a plot outline for my 13th mystery novel, but I sat down and for the first time in my life I had writer's block.
Really?
Yeah, I couldn't write prose.
But the poetry still comes.
The poetry still comes.
That's good.
And the thing with poetry is there's always the challenge of the form of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll probably get to this eventually, but I actually evolved a very specific new way of writing short lyrics.
Oh, yes.
And based on a 3-beat line.
Yes. Well, it'll be interesting to see as these come into our field of focus, right? Because that's coming up next. I guess it just at this point that's all great to hear, and I'm glad that we can talk about Riel because I think it's still relevant. The one thing I was reading was that in the last year there have been at least 5 books about Louis Riel written in Canada.
Oh, is that right?
If not
My
more.
word.
And if you go on Chapters Indigo and start looking for Riel, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books about Riel. I think they could stand to be a little more poetic at times, and so I'm glad that this work's out there for those that are interested. Is there any other thoughts you have on the book, Grandpa?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, well, as always, it's been my pleasure. Don Gutteridge is the author of many books of both prose and poetry. His most recent work is called The Blue Flow Below. Came out this year from Black Moss Press and is available from them. And we're gonna work on getting some of that CBC footage parsed out, and we'll release that as an addendum to this podcast, or perhaps edit it in, depending upon how it all goes. Thank you so much, Grandpa. It's been great talking to you.
Would you stop me saying no, no, no? I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Well, as always, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Clearly, Riel is a work that Grandpa's proud of, and with good reason, I think. Of the three, I find it the most readable, and I think it still holds up all these years later. Louis Riel is such a fascinating character, and as Grandpa said, he's undergone a bit of a rehabilitation in the public eye in the last couple decades, and now that the world of Riel scholarship is wide, it wasn't so wide when Grandpa put this book out, and I think it's important to remember that he was sort of on the leading edge of that rehabilitation, and I think that's something that should be celebrated. If you are looking for a copy of Riel, A Poem for Voices, it's basically you're stuck in the reselling market at this point. There are copies available on Amazon if you're so inclined. When I ordered Coppermine, I got mine in about a week. I think if you wanted to read Riel, you could get your hands on it if you wanted. Now, we do make mention in that conversation of the CBC tapes. I've got those now, so I'm going to try and upload them to the site at some point, just so our listeners can enjoy those as well. It's a good listen. It's the CBC, but it's really great. So yeah, I'll make sure we upload those and you can enjoy them. Now, the next book that we're discussing is Coppermine, The Quest for North. This is the rough one, my friends. It's a great book, but it is dark. This is Grandpa's darkest work that I've ever encountered, and it comes through in our conversation. He can be a little reticent when we talk about Coppermine, just because I don't think he finds it pleasant to relive it, and he certainly said he didn't find it pleasant to reread it. And with, in the interest of full disclosure, I didn't find reading it that pleasant either, but it was important for me to read it. Basically, the context for this book is, in the late 1700s, a guy named Samuel Hearne was employed to travel north from Fort Prince of Wales, which is, I believe, in the northern part of Alberta or Manitoba. Anyway, he was trying to find what was known as the Northern Coppermine, which was this reported source of native copper, they called it, so just raw copper, that was purported to be where the Coppermine River flowed out to the Arctic Sea. He employed a group of native guides, headed by Matanabe, who we hear about, to help him get there. During the trip, an event it's a controversial one, but most scholars seem to agree that it happened in some form or another, but an event called the Bloody Falls Massacre occurred, which basically involved Hearne's guides, which were known as the Northern Cree or the Copper Cree, massacred a group of 20 Inuit at a place called Bloody Falls. It's something you can Google if you're so inclined. It's super unpleasant, and if you were to read Coppermine, that's the crux of the thing, and it is gut-wrenching. That Grandpa would be capable of writing this stuff actually shocked me when I first read it, because it's so at odds with the man whose work I'm so familiar with. But it's interesting to know that there was a rawer time when he was younger, and maybe things were a little darker in there. So, yeah, content warning as usual. This one deals with violence and massacres of Indigenous people. Strap in. It's a good one. It'll challenge you. And without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Don.
But you stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Hello and welcome, everybody. I am here with Don Gutteridge. Hi, Grandpa.
Hi.
Nice to be here again. Nice to be here to talk about Coppermine, the quest for North. So this was a book of poetry. I mentioned a little bit in the intro, but this was a book of poetry that I've learned was actually published in late 1972, came out in 1973. Looks like it was Oberon Press, part of their new Canadian Poets series. And there are actually used copies available. It's probably out of print now, but there are copies to be had. I just got one on Amazon. So, I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you, Grandpa, is, I've talked about your biography and how your writing career progressed, but I wanted to know some of the context around this book. What led you to want to write about Coppermine?
Well, I had written Riel, and so the idea of writing historical poems based on historical events was in my mind. And of course, when you're successful, as Riel was, and because it was quite successful, I'll mention it first and then get to Coppermine.
Absolutely.
It came out as a fiddlehead poetry book in 1968. And sold 500 copies. And no, actually it sold more than that because Fred Cogswell, the publisher, who was also an academic and a poet, Riel was successful because Van Nostrand Reinhold picked it up, I think, in 72.
Yeah.
And published it for schools.
Oh, okay.
And it was a poem for voices, so it was used in drama classes.
Yes.
And it sold 5,000 copies, which is my all-time bestseller for poetry.
Really?
And it would have sold more than that.
Yeah.
They were the school board out there was going to make it a compulsory text for the English program.
Wow.
Or the drama program, one of the two.
Yeah.
But what happened was, one of the members of the committee who was looking at books read Riel and didn't like what I said about Thomas Scott.
Uh-huh.
He was an Orangeman.
Ah.
And he vetoed it.
Oh,
so
boy.
I probably lost thousands of sales.
I'm sure.
And
for some fairly ancient political reasons.
Yeah, we can circle back to Scott later.
Yeah.
That was the so it was very successful, and of course I had written Death at Quebec and other poems, a
Yes.
smaller, slimmer version with shorter historical poems in them. So I
Right.
was in the historical writing mode, and looking around for material, and I came across Samuel Hearne's journal.
Yes.
And I read it through, and I thought, this is a quest story.
Mm-hmm.
It would really look good as a long poem.
Yeah, well, I mean, so that's Samuel Hearne's journal that I believe is called A Journey to the Arctic Sea from Fort Prince of Wales. It's something like
Prince
that.
of Wales, yes, that's right.
Yeah, and it was published posthumously in about 1790 something.
Is that right? No, I've forgotten that.
Yeah. So it was edited in London, and we'll talk more about this when we get to Hearne himself. But
Yeah.
it was published posthumously and was quite popular.
Yeah, it was. That's right. And been in print off and on ever since.
When do you think you read that to begin with?
Well, probably. I would say it would be 71 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably hadn't made the decision to use it for maybe a year, but it just I just let it settle in my mind, and I was absolutely fascinated by it, and quite different from Riel.
Mm-hmm.
But I was fascinated by the idea of the quest for copper.
Yeah.
And the other thing that fascinated me was his attempt to hang on to his sanity, his personality, if you like,
Yes.
in the face of the violence of the weather and the violence of Matanabe and the Northern Crees.
Yes, well, I mean, so I did a little bit of reading about the Coppermine before I actually dove into the poems, and so I knew what was coming. And I encourage our listeners to you know what? I don't encourage them to do the same. I encourage them to read the poetry first, because I knew the crux before I started reading, but it was nonetheless shocking. So you read Hearne's journal. Did you use any other sources?
In this case, no. And I'll tell you how important the journal was.
Mm-hmm.
The first version had an excerpt from the journal on the left side of the page,
Yep.
and a poem dealing with that incident on the right side of the page.
Okay.
And this turned out to be maybe like a 150-page book.
Wow.
And I sent it to Oberon,
Mm-hmm.
and Michael Macklem at Oberon, the publisher, sent me a note back, and he said, "Wonderful poetry, but I won't print the prose." And I said, "Well, it still needs some context."
Mm-hmm.
So I can't remember who came up with the idea for me to write those little scripts over those little introductory scripts.
Yes. Yes.
And I think I came up with that idea, and he said he thought that would really make it work. And it's just enough to give the readers some orientation as to where the poems are and where the people are in the poems.
Yeah, so usually these take the form of about 4 lines that'll sort of introduce the key players and then describe a little bit of the scene that we're looking into.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the story of Hearne's journey and the Coppermine is incredibly compelling and very, very dark in some ways.
Oh yeah, really dark.
Now, there's a couple of things in this work that I find really, really interesting. And I don't know if, did you have a chance to read through this before we talked?
Yes, I did.
Okay, very good, because there's a few sort of specific things I wanted to ask you about. Now, one thing that's really sort of a running current through this is there's a lot of imagery that seems to relate to sort of ancient civilizations and myth. It's a big part of some of these passages, and a lot of mentions of ancient Egypt, I find.
Oh yeah.
There's a fair amount of symbolism there. Was that an interest for you, or did you just think it fit the story?
No, I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it. But well, the image I have of Egypt, of course, is they wore metallic, and sometimes copper vests and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that may have been in the back of my mind, but you're bringing it up as news. Is news to me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You mentioned it a few times, and you also mentioned the Aztecs a couple of times as well.
Yeah.
And it's sort of an interesting parallel between those, sort of ancient civs and then the ancient civilization that they're encountering when they meet the Eskimo. Inuit, but in the book they're Eskimo.
They're Eskimo, yeah.
Yeah, that was before their rebranding, as it were. Just so you know. The other thing that I really like about the book, but the thing that I found really, it can be gut-wrenching, as you were talking about Hearne trying to maintain his sanity in the face of all that emptiness.
Oh God, yes, yeah, the tundra.
Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot of passages where you're talking about, Hearne trying to know where he is.
Where he is, yeah. Where am I? Yeah. And lots of discussion of space and, and moving into space and out of space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so was that an intentional device on your part?
Oh,
or
yeah,
just...
that's right. Yeah. The Northern Cree were hunter-gatherers.
Yes.
They didn't have any towns or villages.
Mm-hmm.
They just wandered around and shot animals. And so that was what attracted me most about that, was how primitive they were in terms of the growth of mankind in general.
Mm-hmm.
They were down at the old hunter-gatherer stage.
Well, and as were the Inuit, and so
And the Inuit, yeah.
contrasting and comparing these two that in the book and in Hearn's narrative are, sworn enemies. There's an interesting passage I have here that I thought was sort of representative of what I'm talking about. And basically, so your your heading here is Mr. Hearn recalls his first 2 journeys in search of the Coppermine, each of which ended in abrupt failure. The first 2 journeys seemed then like self-drifting, over ground, under sky, through a space that was really a continental shifting, flows of ice, sea-rocked, under, over, through. To me, that is a lot of that sort of spare prose you're talking about that just conveys the scope of what Hearn is walking through.
Yeah. There's a lot of skinny little poems throughout the book.
Well, and it's interesting to contrast this to some of your later poems, which we'll get to in subsequent episodes, where a lot of these lines are very short, and a little bit like when we were discussing Summer's Idol, there's very little fat on any of this. It's all very to the point. The other one that I thought was great, and this is just a tiny little passage, but this is a whole page that just has this on it, and basically it's, we walk, drifting over the barrens. We must be huge in this horizontal spacelessness. Snow drifts against our small motion. And then a page of white.
Oh, yeah. One thing about Oberon Press was they did beautiful, beautiful books.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's no pagination in there either, and that's quite deliberate.
Oh, yeah.
Macklem is a designer.
Mm-hmm.
That's his interest.
Yeah.
He designed all his own poetry books. He designed all the covers of all the books they did for me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I was quite surprised at the liberal use of space, but it helps, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and so this was what I meant to ask you. The lack of pagination, made it a little difficult to reference things. I had to get out tape flags so that I could find the pages I was looking at, because I couldn't just write down which page it was.
Me too.
So this use of empty pages, that wasn't your doing. You just submitted this as a text.
Yeah, just as a text, yes.
Okay.
No, I don't think I would have put those on empty pages. No.
Yeah. Okay. That's sort of.
There might have been a large space between that and previous material,
Mm-hmm.
but I wouldn't have been just a single space, because I don't think I would have. They would have had to indulge me, but they did.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing, and it really does sort of. He does a good job of placing those kind of small, thin, spare poems on these empty pages, and somehow it sort of conveys scope in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I find it really fascinating. The other thing that I find about these poems especially is the land and the barrens and the tundra are sort of seen almost as hostile, and I think that's maybe Hearn's mindset you're trying to get through there.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, because they wouldn't be that way to Matanabe, who lived up there and managed to survive, and all his people survived, or at least the ones he didn't beat up.
yeah, the ones he didn't beat to death. That actually brings me, interestingly, to what I wanted to talk about next. The character of Matanabe is fascinating. There's very little we know about him. Most of it comes from Hearn.
Comes from Hearn, yes, that's right.
But there's, especially in Coppermine, there's a lot of reference to, and Hearn, you're quoting Hearn faithfully in this, where Hearn sees Matanabe as a very, as sort of a Westerner. He is a native, but he's very European.
Well, he dressed up like a king when he was at Fort Prince of Wales.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I must have missed that part.
Yeah, he had a crown and everything. Yeah, he thought he was a king.
Oh, my goodness.
No, he hung around Fort Prince of Wales. I didn't really exploit that a great deal in the poem, but which I did more in Borderlands, and that was the fascination of the Indian with the white man.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little bit of that. And there's a bit of almost the comical aspect to Matanabe if he wasn't so cruel.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a passage here that I'm going to read verbatim because I think it captures that as best as we could. And this is, it almost sort of feels like a jig or a reel or something. I think you probably know the part I'm going to talk about, but it's early on in the book, and it's very starkly different than a lot of the other parts of the book. But it's don't be afraid, folks. Step right up and see that famous Indian Matanabe. Look at that brow, that aristocratic. Check that Roman nose, a chin more Attic than Cree. And except for the haughty grin and a reddish blush to the hairless skin, you'd take him for a full-blood European. Come see him prance in a captain's tunic. No war dance here, nor the tom-tom's music, but grace and pause, oh minuetic. The cabin boards throb, the blood is hectic. Jig upon jig, rounds and reels eclectic. What civilized frenzy in this fantastic. And see Mr. Moses Norton, puppeteer, cum laude, pull the strings, and laugh and cheer. At each jerky step his minion makes, this crossbred impresario just shakes a semi-Indian hand, and low strings descend. The stage redounds with new-formed Englishmen. Now don't be shy, folks, pay your shilling and see the transformation of Matanabe. That's completely different than the rest of the book. But I think it captures a little bit of what we're talking about when we talk about Matanabe, because he is, I mean, this story doesn't lend itself easily to protagonist-antagonist, because there's a little bit of all of them in all the characters. Mm-hmm. But if there's a character that would be the antagonist in this story, Matanabe is probably him. Mm-hmm. Now, the other character that Hearn certainly viewed that way was Moses Norton. Mm-hmm. Norton is, and I talked a little about this in the intro, but Norton was he's a controversial figure even now.
Yeah, is that right? Yeah.
No, absolutely. He, because a lot of people, Hearn had a very negative view of him, of course. Mm-hmm. Most of the narrative on Norton comes from Hearn. But they sort of feel like Hearn is a bit of he's a bit biased because he clearly didn't like the man much. But there's a passage, and I'll leave it for the audience to read, where he discovers Norton after one of his stupors, and he can't even get his feet, can't speak, just out of it. So he sort of had this view of Hearn, or had a view of Norton as a bit of a dilettante, and a man of appetites and a hypocrite.
Yeah, and a hypocrite to boot, yeah.
Now, sort of the main, I wouldn't say the main portion, or the main event that this book leads up to is what's known as the Bloody Falls Massacre.
Right.
Which is, and I led up to this in the intro, but that was Hearn describes in his journal the massacre by his they're the Copper Cree? Is that... Mm-hmm. The Copper Cree massacring about 20 Inuits they had discovered on their way to the Arctic Sea.
Yeah.
That passage is, of course, brutal to read. How did it feel to write?
So brutal that I haven't read it for 25 years, and so you asked me to reread it.
Yes.
And I thought, oh my God, did I write this? But that was the excruciating scene when they killed those Eskimos, and of course there was no particular reason for the feud. I mean, they weren't competing in the same area at all. Mm-hmm. They were contiguous, mm-hmm. and that was enough.
Yeah, well, and even sort of modern scholarship on this is divided about why exactly the feud existed. But you see in a lot of Matanabe, when he's telling the stories, he repeatedly refers to the crooked eye of the Eskimo. And when you read Hearn's journal, you hear the Copper Cree asserting that we're not the same species as these people. They're different than us. Yeah. And Hearn expressing private reservations about that.
Yeah.
So it was hard to read through that again.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Yeah, I would say of all the books I've written, Coppermine is the one I reread and have reread the least.
Yeah.
Because it upsets me even to read it.
Well, and I was talking to Mom the other week, and she said she avoids Coppermine too. I think she said she read it the last time maybe in the 90s and hasn't reread it since.
No.
And I was talking to my friend Joe Organ, and he was saying, I don't think I've read that one. And I said, I don't think you've read it either, Joe.
You'd remember it.
You'd remember if you had read it. So I guess the question I wanted to ask you is, do you think you could write something like this now?
Oh, no.
No?
Not at all. No, that was when I went through those 4 epics on Indians.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the sorts of things that interested me artistically as a poet.
Mm-hmm.
And what follows next, and we can talk about next time, is suddenly I switched to a true history of Lambton County.
Yes.
And from that point on, both my prose and poetry soften.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, my fiction tends to be more comic and light.
Yes.
And so I got it out of my system very, very early.
How old would you have been when these came out? You would have been in your 30s, your 40s?
Mid-30s, yeah.
Yeah. So you would have been a young scholar at that point, comparatively.
Yeah.
What got you interested in writing about the history of Indigenous people in Canada in this way?
I've always been interested in Indians as a people, both in history courses I've taken, and even going back to the childhood days of playing cowboys and Indians. I always wanted to be Cochise, the Comanche Indian chief.
Yes.
Who was a good Indian.
Yes.
and we used to, and whenever we'd play cowboys and Indians, I always volunteered to be the Indian. And I've always wanted to take their side.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember you and I when I was young, we went on a trip I don't know if you remember this. Do you remember we went to Ste. Marie among the Hurons when I was a kid?
I do remember that.
And I remember we talked a lot about that, this sort of the history of which tribe is that? Do you remember which tribe it was up there?
It would be the Hurons.
It was of course, Ste. Marie among the Hurons. No. Jeez. Way to put it together, Gutteridge.
The odd Algonquin visitor.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that I had forgotten about Ste. Marie among the Hurons is I didn't remember that they killed everyone there. I was talking to Mom about it, and she was like, well, yeah, there was a massacre there. And I said, I didn't remember that. I just remembered being entranced by the Huron way of life. I didn't remember them. I didn't remember them killing the.
I don't know whether they told us that when they were taking us around.
It may well be, because I didn't remember them killing the Jesuits as being part of that narrative.
Yeah.
But the one thing I wanted to ask you about this, and now that I think about it, we didn't get a chance when we talked about Summer's Idol the first time. There's a lot of mentions of an Indian burial ground in Point Edward. Was that a real thing?
No, but it comes back again in Lily's story.
Ah, okay.
The Southerner, a character in Lily's story, ends up right in the middle of Point Edward, right where the slip would be now, which they dug out.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he was buried, and Lily finds his grave marker.
Oh, okay.
And so that's obviously been a theme of mine.
Well, no, absolutely, and I do remember in my younger days we talked a lot about Native people and about their history in Canada, and you have many books that reference it, absolutely. And Tecumseh, which we will talk about next, is probably this one is almost entirely an Indigenous narrative too, but Tecumseh goes more into their power politics and the role they played on politics on a larger scale.
Right.
Absolutely. Now, the one thing I had never heard about before I read Coppermine, and I actually had to go looking for it, was the story of James Knight. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, right.
The fella that sailed into the Arctic Sea, got stranded on the island, it's basically just across the ice from the mouth of the Coppermine, which I forget the name of. I'll say it in the closing part. I'll do my research a little better. But he and a crew got stranded, managed to last for a couple seasons, and then all eventually died of various diseases.
Yeah.
And no one knew what happened to them until Hearn got to the mouth of the Coppermine. Or maybe
right.
maybe it was even after that. But that nobody had known what had happened to James Knight for a long time until they finally got to the mouth of the Coppermine and were able to talk to some of the Inuit around there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting and tragic story, and that was the thing I felt about Hearn's story too. Is when they teach history in Canada, they don't teach this kind of thing very often.
No.
It's we focus more on the development of the political blocks we know instead of the interesting Canadian narratives that are out there.
Yeah, right.
And the interesting part about this one is, like I said, there's a lot of back and forth on how much of Hearn's narrative is a complete faithful retelling and how much is, because it was published posthumously as sort of an adventure tale.
Yeah.
Some parts of it they think have probably been jazzed up for production, but I think the the main narratives and the part that you deal with in Coppermine of him trying to stay sane in the middle of all that ice and just no trees. They're above the tree line the whole time.
Mm-hmm, they are.
And that's, I think Coppermine does a really good job of talking about that. Now, another thing, I suppose I should say, I keep saying the one thing. I have many things I want to ask you. Another thing I wanted to ask you, I can't say I've encountered a lot of historical poetry in my time. Was this a popular genre at any time, or was this just something you got interested in?
At the time, in the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s, the long poem, which of course goes back to E.J. Pratt, way back in the 30s.
Yeah.
But the long poem tradition, there's a long poem written in the late 50s called The Victorian House by Philip Child.
Yeah.
Dorothy Livesey has written several longer poems.
Okay.
And Margaret Atwood wrote one. I can't remember now which one it is, but she took one of the female figures from history and did what I did. Wrote a series of the Journals of Susanna Moody.
Oh, okay.
Which was a very popular book.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was not original with this. There was a great curiosity about the long poem.
Mm-hmm.
And the first poems I had published in the very early 60s by Fred Cogswell out at Fiddlehead Poetry Books were about 500 or 600 line poems.
Yes.
And I did 5 of those.
Wow.
And he published them all over a period of 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And so I was attracted to the narrative poem, the longer poem.
Mm-hmm.
They were long line, straight narratives, very much like Riel.
Yes.
And so Coppermine represents a real break stylistically.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and I think it's sort of, having read a lot of your poems over the years, these historical poems are a different breed than what came later, and it's interesting to see how your style has changed over the years.
Yeah.
Some parts are still the same. It's all been very spare always. Yeah. When I write poems, I can't help but be wordy. I just put so many bloody words on the page.
I know, and I actually envy you.
Yeah.
We're never satisfied.
Well, and I was talking to Joe Organ, and he writes beautifully spare poetry, and I think it's maybe a little bit of that songwriter's mind he's got, but he can compress a thought into 4 or 5 words that would take me 10. So I play a lot with the music of language, but I think, it's interesting we're never satisfied. That's a good way to put it. This actually, now that you've mentioned Fred Cogswell, he's who Coppermine is dedicated to.
Yeah.
But this would probably be a good end to talking about a fiasco that happened in 1973 involving the Governor General's Awards. Now, it is my understanding that you found out somewhat recently
yes.
that Coppermine actually was the presumed winner of this until there was some kind of machinations. Do you want to explain to me exactly what happened a little bit?
Well, actually, I knew about it Probably in 1974 at one of the meetings of the Canadian poets, and Fred Cogswell said to me,
I'm sorry, Grandpa, who is Fred Cogswell?
Fred Cogswell was a very famous academic and poet and translator who ran the Fiddlehead Poetry Books. He published over 200 books of poetry during his time out there. He typed them all himself.
Yeah, really?
He was a human dynamo and a very respected academic and critic, as well as a good poet and translator. So he was chosen to be the judge in the 1973.
Yep.
And he told me a year later, he came up to me and he said, I couldn't vote for your book because I have been your publisher.
Yep. Well, it's a plain conflict of interest.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, I'd forgotten I'd even dedicated it to him, so there was no way he could vote for it.
No.
But then I heard from John Moss, another well-known critic and novelist and academic all his life.
Yeah.
And at that time, he was friends with what we called the Kingston Group.
Yes.
A group of poets and novelists gathered around Michael Ondaatje in Kingston.
Yes.
And John Moss told me that what happened was that Miriam Mandel, who won the award,
Miriam Mandel's book "Lions at Her Face" was the one that won. Yep.
It was the one that won, and he said that she had been Michael Ondaatje's lover.
Oh, okay.
She had divorced her husband, poet Eli Mandel, a couple of years before.
Okay, yeah.
And had a serious breakup with Ondaatje. And she went to the University of Alberta, where she met Sheila Watson, another well-known author and academic, who ran this little publishing company. And what happened, this is what I pieced together. What must have happened was John Moss said, I think they persuaded Sheila Watson to vote for her as compensation for her breakup.
For the difficult time she'd had.
The difficult time she had. So I that part of the story is relatively recent because it came from John Moss, whom I had written to ask him if he did know anything about this, because I knew he knew all these, that he knew all these people. But Sheila Watson is the real villain.
Yeah.
Not Miriam.
Yeah.
Because she was her teacher, her advocate, and her publisher.
Well, similar to how Cogswell was yours.
Yeah, and so she should have recused herself.
Yes.
And the third judge should have picked the winner.
Yes.
But Fred, being a gentleman, recused himself, and Watson vigorously, and I'm assuming this because she won out, vigorously advocated for her own student.
Well, it would stand to reason, right? Because didn't you get tipped that you thought it was going to go your way, a little ahead?
That was part of the story that turned out not to be true.
Okay. Okay. Well, because this sort of narrative has been coalescing over the last year, and we've sort of talked about it.
That's why I put together that little piece for you, that little summary, which I've just pretty much given you, and because there were bits and pieces that were floating around, and some of them were accurate and some of them weren't.
It's funny how 40 years on you can you can still be uncovering info about this kind of thing.
Well, I still feel I was robbed, but because it is a good book, and
it is.
And Fred said, "Well, you'll win it again someday. Don't worry about it." I said, of course, I was a very shy person. I should have said to Fred, well, why in the world did you let Miriam win that? Because nobody's ever heard of her. This was a year later. Nobody had ever heard of her.
Yep.
They knew that she was Eli Mandel's wife, but they didn't know she wrote poetry.
Yeah.
She didn't write any poetry until she went to the University of Alberta and wrote that first book.
Well, she won the Governor General's Award for it.
She won the Governor General's Award for it.
I mean, that must have been good for her self-confidence, but I would certainly like to submit my poems and get the Governor General's Award for it.
Well, I did win one poetry prize, the President's Medal of
Yes.
Western University
For Death at Quebec.
for Death at Quebec.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of made up for it. So that was all around the same part of my career, that early phase. But it all ended when I switched to Lambton County.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the stakes are a little less high when you're talking about Lambton County.
But of course, the history comes back into Lily's story. That my love of history, and the whole novel Lily's story is built on a series of real historical events which affect Lily's life.
Yeah.
Even my little novel, All in Good Time, is really about the history of the little village in 1944 and the visit of the Governor General, and there's a lot of local history in that.
Well, and you see a lot of that. Your clear love of history pervades a lot of your books, I would say, including, if there's any justice, we'll have an episode about Lily, and we'll also talk about Mark Edwards, which is your most recent books. And Mark Edwards is a masterclass in incorporating real history into a fictional narrative. Absolutely. It's all pretty fascinating, and I think Coppermine is really the part I find interesting about it is that this was the first of your work that was, I guess the word I want to use is it's raw, it's polished, but it carries an emotional weight, and I think your later works do too. But it's you're much more wistful in a lot of your more recent works. This is clearly there is a hard edge to this.
Yeah, there's a really hard edge to it. Yeah.
So how does it make you feel to read this 40 years later?
I don't enjoy it, although there were some parts, and particularly that little odd one that you read out, and so on, and even the first part where I used the long lines to describe the copper woman and so on.
Yes.
I thought, golly, I could write long lines in those days. I can't do it anymore. I can't get beyond 3 syllables or 3 stresses.
Yeah.
But so there were things I admired in it, individual poems and so on.
Yeah.
And that's been my response in rereading all of these historical ones, that there is some good poetry in there.
Yeah, and so I think there's a lot to be proud of in Coppermine, but it's an emotional read, and it can be I mean, considering you can read it in about 45 minutes, it's a tough 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, that's really great, Grandpa. I enjoyed reading it in as much as I enjoy reading any of your work. I think, you're right. It is a hard one. I think Tecumseh, which we'll do next, is a little bit of it's certainly got its hard parts too, but I think it's a little bit more of there's more of an interesting, multifaceted story there that isn't quite so hard on the mind.
Well, in rereading it earlier in the week, I was struck by the fact that I was trying to do a lot of things in there with all of that first part, and with all those pioneers and so on to set the historical context. Yep. When what I really wanted to write about was Tecumseh.
Yeah.
So I have no idea why I did that, but of course, Death at Quebec I'd already written, and I put it back in there as part of that. But I wanted to give the reader, when you get to Tecumseh, there's no linear story. It roughly goes through. Yeah. But it's called Dreams and Visions. In fact, I wanted Oberon to put that on the cover, Tecumseh Dreams and Visions. But he quite rightly put it on the second part, because the first part wasn't really, well, they were a bit of a dream and vision, but not like the last part. But I thought I would give people some poems that set the context in which Tecumseh existed, because it's a much more civilized, even though it's primitive and pioneer, it's a much more civilized society, and he was a much more civilized Indian.
Well, and it's 50 years later and 30 degrees of latitude lower. Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because there is a lot of, brutality in this story, and Hearn wrestling with that is, I think, one of the really strong parts of it, but it certainly puts the reader through the ringer. Well, I guess that will do it. Thank you very much, Grandpa. As always, it's been lovely talking to you. So Don Gutteridge has a book of poetry out this year called The Blue Flow Below from Black Moss Press. You can also find the most recent Mark Edwards mystery. What's the name of the most recent one, Grandpa?
The Widow's Demise.
The Widow's Demise, available at Chapters Indigo and online. And it's been great talking to you, Grandpa, and I look forward to next time.
Thank you.
Would you stop me saying no, no, no? I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
So, how's everyone feeling after that? Even re-listening to it as I put this all together, I started to get a little unsettled by the content all these months after we recorded it. Clearly, Coppermine's one that Grandpa finds challenging. All the business about the 1973 Governor General's Award, this was actually news to me this year. I had never heard of this before. On some level, it's interesting to me that Grandpa still thinks about this kind of thing 40 years later, but on another level, I get it. I did get a chance to read the work that won, and it's not great. It's not great. Coppermine's better. But, I am horribly biased, so maybe don't take my word for it. Well, now that we've gotten through that, the last work we're going to be discussing now is called Tecumseh, Dreams and Visions. Now, Tecumseh's a well-known figure in Canadian and American history. I don't really need to outline him. Google is your friend. He's a towering figure. I mean, his name's all over everything. Clearly, this is another work that Grandpa's quite proud of, and it was one that was staged at UWO. I truly wish that, this is one of these situations we keep getting into where Grandpa, a lot of these works have been staged in various forms, but the record of same is negligible. We still haven't been able to locate any evidence of Tecumseh's staging. As soon as we do, I'll make sure that it's available to our listeners. Tecumseh's the shortest of our conversations. Not that there's less to it, but I think there was just not quite as much to talk about, and maybe we were both a little burned out by Coppermine at this point. But still, it's a good conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Tecumseh is also available on the resale market, and there are many copies available on Amazon for those that are so inclined. Without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Don.
No, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Everybody, welcome back. I am here again with my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, and we are going to be speaking about his 1976, is it 76, Grandpa?
75.
75, the 1975 book Tecumseh, also known as Tecumseh, Dreams and Visions. Hi, Grandpa.
Hi.
It's lovely to be here with you again.
Mm-hmm.
Into this, our third of the historical epics, as I've been calling them. I think it's accurate. These books, they're different. So each one is different in its own way. Now, Riel was the last of your sort of long line poems.
Mm-hmm.
Coppermine was very, very spare and tight and cold. Tecumseh is more of the sort of short line poetry,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a little bit of a richer experience than Coppermine. Now, the one thing I noticed, the beginning of this is the poem Death at Quebec.
Yeah.
So, remind me again, Death at Quebec is a 1970 poem?
Yes.
And was that the one that you were nominated for a medal at, or you won?
The UWO President's Medal.
Right.
For the best periodical poem of the year.
Okay. And so you won that in 70, and then you put it at the beginning of Tecumseh.
Because I was looking for pioneer poems, and I thought, well, I wrote one good one in 1970, so I recycled it.
Now, the one thing I can't seem to pick out now is that whose perspective is Death at Quebec written from?
Oh, one of the habitants, I guess you'd call them.
Okay. It's not from the view of a historic figure so much.
Not at all. No, and imagine habitant having a rough go.
Yes, I'm very, very much so. I guess I should preface this with Tecumseh from Oberon is actually out of print, but again, like many of these books, there are copies available for those that are interested. Grandpa got one recently on Amazon, and I see that there's a couple more out there. It's really amazing how Amazon can rally these small bookstores.
Mm-hmm. It is, isn't it?
My copy of Coppermine came from Cardinal Books in Burr. So that's just right in our backyard. It sort of seems not that surprising they would have a copy. But didn't your copy of Tecumseh come from the West Coast?
Yes, it came from BC.
It's amazing. It's amazing how far they've traveled in the last 40 years. So this book is just about 40 years old at this point. So you've read through it in the last week or so, as did I. What as Riel was a poem for voices, Tecumseh is its sort of underlying theme is dreams and visions. Where did that come to you from?
Well, I had a choice when I decided that I've always loved the story of Tecumseh, and he's always been one of my heroes, really, from the days I encountered him in my history courses. But no, I decided I had to make a decision after writing Riel. As these new poems came into my head,
yes,
was I going to return to the straight narrative structure,
right, or
was I going to try and get a more fluid, free-flowing structure? And the idea of voices still permeates the book itself.
Absolutely.
So you have the pioneer voices in the first part, and then Tecumseh in the second part. And so what I did was I just, as I sat down and read the standard biography, Glenn Tucker's standard biography of Tecumseh,
right,
ideas would come into my head. Well, here's an event that needs to have a poem written about it.
Yes.
So it was that loose. There was very little attempt to create even a superficial narrative structure, although the poems do flow from the beginning to the end.
They flow more or less chronologically.
They do, yes.
Because Riel has a very clear arc.
Yes.
And Coppermine, too, has quite a clear arc.
Right.
Coppermine has probably the most straight-ahead narrative of any of them, but it's the smallest story, right?
Yes, right.
It has I guess the smallest in that it has the least impact on the world we live in today. I mean, it's important that part of the world got explored, but Tecumseh is completely wrapped in with the story of Upper Canada.
Yeah, that's right.
So you said that your first ever poem was about Wolfe and Montcalm.
Right.
But we also, I remember a lot when I was young, would talk a lot about the War of 1812.
Yes.
Has that been an interest of yours for a long time?
It has, and I wrote a novel about it called How the World Began, which is set during the 1812, 1813, and involves some of the battles, involves Tecumseh. He's a character in it as well.
Okay.
So, and I wrote that, I think, in 90 or 91.
Yep.
And so my interest has never lagged in that period.
Yeah. Well, and it sort of it leads into a period, well, it is part of and leads into a period that's been very fruitful for you. You've written a lot of both fiction and poetry set in the sort of the post-1812 world.
Yes.
The Tecumseh contains, reference to Isaac Brock and the other generals he fought with, but it really does focus. It focuses on him almost as sort of a narrative thread, but the poems branch off. So it's not so much a biographical account of Tecumseh.
No. If you were going there, you would be disappointed.
Yeah. Now I think one of the things that I found really interesting about this book is its verse structure. So the way that the poems are laid out is more reminiscent of Coppermine. They're narrow verse, they're spare, and they're focused. The overall impression I got from it is much closer to Riel. Like there's more of a I guess I feel like Coppermine is a very spare, dark, cold book.
Yes.
This has more of the warmth of narrative to it for sure.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, because Tecumseh was a very civilized man.
Yes.
And I put a section in there which I found in the historical record that when he was living near Greenville, he was befriended by a local family.
Yes.
Who taught him to read. And I speculate that he may have read Hamlet.
Oh, okay.
And that whole thing may be apocryphal, but there is a story in American history of that encounter, and a summary of it written by the young woman.
Yes.
And I think it came from a local newspaper.
Yeah, well, and Tecumseh in a lot of his speeches, so the latter half of the book, and this is skipping ahead, the not latter half of the book, the last 20% of the book is a series of addresses Tecumseh's making to the various tribes.
Great rhetorical speeches. And what happened was he would have an interpreter beside him, and he would speak, pause, they would interpret, and then he'd carry on with the next image, pause, interpret. He was a master at what we would call political speech making.
Do you remember when you first learned about Tecumseh?
Golly, no. I think I did learn about him because I played softball in Tecumseh Park in Chatham.
Yep.
And I wondered who this figure was, and somebody said, "Well, there's an obelisk or a monument to him down on Highway 2." And a friend drove me down there, and we saw a brief description of the battle and so on.
Yeah.
And battles have always interested me, so that's probably how the whole thing started. But I don't honestly remember what follow-up I did, but that was my first encounter. I kept wondering, who's this park named after?
Well, Tecumseh's ubiquitous, right? I believe there's a public school named after him in
yes.
London.
In London.
You're talking about Tecumseh Park in Chatham. Yeah, he's a name that's all over the place.
Yeah.
And there's Tecumseh, Ontario out that way too.
Yeah, that's right.
That's sort of Windsor area, correct?
Right.
Yes. Because at the end of the book, you sort of talk about Tecumseh's legacy, and you do mention both of those things. It's amazing. He is a really rich figure. He's one that I am also interested in. I suspect it's because you and I toured rather a lot of battlefields when I was young. I guess the thing that I always connected to, and I connect to it in this book more than any of the others, is that this setting is our backyard.
Yes, definitely.
This happened here.
Yeah.
Now, where was the Battle of the Thames River?
Well, that was it's out actually in the middle of nowhere. The monument to him is about I would say maybe 35 or 40 miles above Windsor,
Yeah,
on
okay.
highway, just off Highway 2.
Mm-hmm.
And the little settlement that was there was burned to the ground by the American troops when they invaded,
Right.
and so it is no longer there. And there's no battlefield you can visit, or they've never tried to sort of recreate it as they might have as a tourist kind of thing.
Yeah.
All you've got is this little monument with a little plaque on it, and that's all that's left.
Yeah, well, it's not...
Moravian Town was the name of the town,
Right.
because it was started by the Moravian brothers,
Yep.
and they were very hospitable to the Indians,
Mm-hmm.
and Christianized a number of them, and the American troops burned it to the ground.
Yeah. Well, it's because the sort of the 1812 battlefields we know well, I believe Longwoods was... Longwoods.
Near London, yeah, the Battle of Longwoods, yeah.
And then Lundy's Farm is the one everybody knows
Yeah.
about, which is in Niagara proper.
That's right.
And then it's interesting because the Battle of the Thames is pivotal. I mean, that's where Tecumseh dies.
Yeah.
But it's not. The reason I asked it because I wasn't really able to figure it out. I was having a brief read through this, and I couldn't seem to piece together where this had happened.
Yeah, well, it was one of the early battles, and it allowed the Americans to invade up almost to London, and there was a scorched earth policy. They burned farms as they came up, and so on. And this comes up in my novel, How the World Began. It deals with those incidents. So they've been in my mind for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, the germ of it clearly is clearly still present, because I guess you would have written How the World Began 15 years later.
Yes.
Yeah, and that would have been after some novels and some more poetry.
Yes.
Now, the one thing that's interesting is you... Okay, I gotcha. Okay, so one of the features of this book I found pretty interesting was its... And you talked about how this is the same in Borderlands. A lot of the time it's two voices, and you'll get either a pioneer voice or a voice from the British hierarchy, and then you'll see, or the American hierarchy.
That's right.
And then Tecumseh will be the other half of it.
Yeah.
So these people you're quoting, are these direct quotations, or are you reimagining their statements?
They're reimagined. Yeah, I don't use found material the way I did in some of the other books.
Right. And so this was the book that enjoyed a staging at UWO.
Yes, Professor Maureen Fox did a wonderful job. All she did was she went through and picked out tiny little bits and pieces of it that would dramatize, and there was a cast of about 12 or 13.
Right.
And they did the whole pioneer section, and they did Tecumseh, and they wrote original music for it. It was an absolutely stunning production, done on a thrust stage at Western.
Wow.
And they were going to film it, but the camera broke down, so we don't have any record of it. And she never even gave me a copy of the script, so I don't. It's just gone into the ether.
Yeah, well, and this is a theme we keep encountering. Is there's so much material around all these stories we've talked about has been lost to the ether. Grandma was saying she thought maybe there were pictures of this production somewhere.
There are, but we haven't been able to find them. As soon as we do, we'll let you know.
Yeah, let me loose on them. We'll get them up for
a
everyone
wonderful
to see.
series of photographs that they took.
And it's interesting. I would say, with the exception of Coppermine, both of these have been staged in some performance format at least once.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something you ever envisioned, or was that just a byproduct?
That was a byproduct. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I saw myself strictly as a poet, and I have too much respect for playwrights
to fancy yourself one.
To fancy myself one, exactly.
Yeah, well,
It's almost as if I didn't have enough nerve to make them full plays
yeah.
with stage directions and all the rest of it. But I don't have a great visual sense, and I think certainly for modern theater you need to have a strong visual sense.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of motion in modern theater. The Tecumseh play just moved quite dramatically with actors moving and flowing and miming, and it was a wonderful production. I just sat in awe during rehearsals. I couldn't believe this was coming to life in front of me.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't in sort of a... This would be in the... I guess, Can Lit had been enjoying somewhat of a revival in those days.
Mm-hmm.
This was sort of a part of the sort of early to mid period of the CanCon, like the Can Lit.
Yeah, right.
Was sort of finding its moment, and so
yeah,
it was
definitely.
It was kind of ideally placed at a good place in time for the staging of that kind of thing, which I think maybe we could use a little more of these days.
The 70s was a very rich period in Canadian literature, and Rudy Weeb wrote a book that won the Governor General's Award, The Temptations of Big Bear, and there was a lot of interest in indigenous stories. And Robert Croach wrote a book called Gone Indian, which is an absolutely wonderful, surreal treatment of the Indian dilemma.
Okay. Well, we'll have to include a link to that too, because this is the sort of thing that I think people would still be interested in reading. The question I always ask you about these books, and I'm interested to hear how you feel about this one. How does it feel to read it again after all this time?
I really like that book because it's warmer.
Yeah.
I like the pioneer voices, and I was particularly moved again by the ending, the last couple of poems in the book by Tecumseh.
Yeah. It is absolutely moving. I guess the question I want to ask you, because now we find ourselves at the end of where we're going to explicitly treat these poems. There is another called Borderlands,
right,
which comes chronologically after Tecumseh.
Right.
They sometimes get classified mythic tetralogy?
Yeah.
Was how that one paper describes it.
Yeah.
Well, we've touched on Borderlands because it's informed by a lot of this, but this will be the end of our formal treatment of these books. When you've read back through them, what are the parts that you like? What are the parts you are... I guess what parts stick out to you after reading the group?
It's like reading a collection of individual poems.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain speeches and poems that I think, golly, I really could write when I wanted to. Mm-hmm. That's the feeling I had through Tecumseh, and less with Coppermine because it's so dark and shocking.
Yes.
That, I can't really say I enjoyed rereading it, but I still look at it and wonder where it came from in my own psyche, really. But I must have been having some dark thoughts at the time. But of course, Hearn's journal was so tremendously made such a tremendous impression on me.
Yeah.
I said, I've got to put this into poetry.
Oh no, absolutely. That Hearn's journal is still incredibly gripping.
I mean, it's a work of literature in its own right.
So I guess the only other thing I would wonder about is after you read through, do you have a favorite of the three?
Borderlands is my favorite.
Borderlands is your favorite,
but in terms of the poetry in it, then I would think Tecumseh, and then Riel, and then Coppermine.
Yeah,
but it was wonderful to go back through them, and I'd like to thank you, Tom, for making these rereads possible, because I really wouldn't have probably ever gone back and reread those.
Well,
they were so... I mean, that's 40 years ago. That's so long ago, and I'm still writing poetry and thinking about the next one I'm going to write.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, it's my pleasure, and it's been my pleasure to talk about them with you. It's from where I sit, it's very interesting to see some of this earlier work. Really, the only one I can't square with my modern conception of your work is Coppermine. It does not even seem like it was written by you.
No. No, that's quite right. And I only reread it because you asked me to.
Yes, it was the one that we were probably both most reticent to speak about because it's so dark. But I see in Tecumseh, I see the seeds of what comes next. Towards the end of Tecumseh, you're writing poetry that looks a lot like your early lyric poetry. So it's sort of interesting how you can see the seeds of what comes next in the later parts of these books. Okay, well, I guess that will do it for us today. As always, thank you very much, Grandpa. It's been a great time talking to you.
You're welcome.
So next, once we're back in the studio again, we will be discussing the earliest part of Grandpa's lyric poetry. And we will look forward to that. So Don Gutteridge is the author of many, many books of fiction and poetry. He actually has one book out this year of an anthology of poetry from Black Moss Press called The Blue Flow Below. So look for it there, and we will link to all the relevant content will be linked on our website, which will be going live soon. So thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day. Bye now.
Bye.
No, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. And thank you and congratulations for sticking with a very long episode. The Mythics are a special part of Grandpa's career, and I think it's great that we had a chance to look them over together. They're not something he thinks about often these days, so it seems, and they're not something I had thought about in years. They were a great experience reading them. I'm not sure I'll be rereading them anytime soon. But I do hope that our listeners will, if they're interested, pick up a copy. If I was going to choose one, it would have to be Riel, but I think all three are worth a read for any that are so inclined. As always, thank you to Joe Organ and the band Moves for the use of their song A Little Longer for the intro and outro of our podcast. You can find Joe Organ on SoundCloud and Moves on Bandcamp. A Little Longer is from the 2013 album Tape. It's a great album. Moves is a great band, and Joe Organ is a wonderful man and a wonderful musician. Go check his stuff out. He's the dude. I mean, there's nobody as good as Joe when it comes to putting out some interesting music. As far as Don's work goes, he's got 3 books of poetry out right now, all available from Black Moss Press in Canada. The most recent is The Blue Flow Below, released this year. And if you want to look back at one of our earlier podcasts, we actually talk about the other 2, Tidings and Inundations. All are readily available for those that are interested. Now, the intent with this podcast was never to, microanalyze or aggressively plug Grandpa's work or anything like that. It's more about enjoying the work and spending a little bit of time together. But if you've enjoyed what you've heard, feel free to tell a friend. It always helps. Find us on iTunes, and if you can rate, review, and subscribe, it always helps get our stuff out there. Thank you so much for joining us on There and Then, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.